In the summer of 1969, the United States Army Corps of Engineers did something that seemed almost unthinkable. They turned off one of the most powerful waterfalls on Earth. That's right, for the first time in thousands of years, the American side of Niagara Falls, normally thundering with millions of gallons of water every minute, was reduced to a dry, rocky cliff. When the water disappeared, it revealed a hidden world beneath the falls, as engineers and onlookers discovered thousands of coins tossed in by tourists over the decades, as well as some rather unsettling artifacts, including human remains. But as remarkable as these discoveries were, the real question is, why did they do it in the first place? Surprisingly, the answer wasn't necessity, it was aesthetics. In the name of tourist satisfaction, officials intended to give the American Falls a facelift. So why exactly did the government shut off Niagara Falls? How was such an extraordinary operation even possible? And what did scientists learn when the water stopped flowing? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the story of when Niagara Falls was switched off. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's go back about 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age drew to a close and the colossal Laurentide ice sheet began its retreat northward. In its wake, it left behind a carved basin that would become the Great Lakes, and from there, a new river began to take shape, the Niagara River, channeling the overflow from Lake Erie down towards Ontario. The falls that formed back then were not the ones we see today. In fact, they originally lay much further downstream and were thought to have been broader, more chaotic, and arguably more magnificent. With that in mind, over millennia, the constant erosion of soft shale and limestone beneath the harder dolomite caprock caused the falls to slowly migrate upstream, retreating approximately 7 miles to their current position. Even so, by any measure, this natural wonder is a spectacle of power. At peak flow, roughly 45 million gallons of water cascade over the combined falls, making this the type of sight that leaves a meaningful impression on people regardless of their origins. While the indigenous people regarded the falls as a sacred, living part of the landscape, early European settlers saw it as a curiosity to document, then the sublime, and eventually a resource. The first European documentation came from French missionary Louis Hennepin in 1678, whose written account introduced the falls to the wider world, though with considerable theatrical exaggeration. This was common. Early European descriptions routinely exaggerated the height of the falls by a factor of twofold or more. So if we fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, Niagara Falls had become firmly embedded in the romantic imagination as one of the great landscapes of the New World. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it, and philosophers used it as proof of nature's overwhelming power. As a result of all this, the falls became one of North America's earliest tourist destinations, complete with hotels, viewing platforms, and guides who would take you to the most dramatic vantage points for a fee, of course. And so, it wouldn't take long before the honeymooners started showing up. Napoleon's brother, for example, brought his American bride, Elizabeth Patterson, to the falls in 1803, and then many other elite-class people followed this trend. And then, another interesting shift occurred in the public perception of the region, as Niagara Falls underwent a type of commercialization, gradually giving way to more vulgar forms of mass spectacle. For instance, in 1827, as tourism at the falls began to take on this new character, local promoters staged one of the earliest and most disturbing spectacles in the falls' history, when a decommissioned boat was loaded with a collection of animals, including a buffalo, a bear, and several smaller creatures, before it was ultimately sent over the falls to the entertainment of a paying crowd. The stunt was intended to attract attention and draw visitors in who would book hotel rooms and pay for other services in the area, but it came at a cost. Most of the animals perished upon impact, though one account claims that the goose survived, escaping the descent at the last moment by flying away. Beyond that, the arrival of the railroads only amplified this notion, as for the first time, thousands of ordinary people could afford to reach the natural wonder from places like Buffalo and Albany, or even further via connections to New York and Toronto. So what had once been a remote and costly journey reserved for the wealthy was rapidly becoming accessible to the emerging middle class. By the early 1840s, rail lines such as the Great Western Rail and connecting American routes had effectively plugged Niagara Falls into a growing continental network. travelers could now arrive in a matter of hours rather than days, and with them came that new kind of audience, larger, more diverse, and increasingly hungry for spectacle. It was in this environment that the more outrageous attractions began to unfold routinely. Promotional stunts like daredevils going over the falls in a barrel began to draw even louder crowds. And we should reflect on that for a moment. What's perhaps most interesting is, even back then, the raw grandeur of nature was repackaged and sold to the more impulsive among us, which begs a kind of deeper question about human nature. Why do we constantly feel the need to enhance what's already awe-inspiring? Regardless of the answer to that question, nature would come to shock everyone beyond what any barrel stunt could do, when the rivers stopped flowing. When Abraham Lincoln visited Niagara Falls in 1848, he reflected on its timeless power, noting that it had been roaring long before the rise and fall of civilizations, and would likely continue to do so long after. So it's somewhat ironic that in March of that same year, nearby residents began to notice something that they perceived as being deeply wrong. The sound, that ever-present roar that locals barely even registered anymore, was fading. By the morning of March 30th, it had stopped almost entirely. The American Falls had slowed to a trickle. People gathered on the banks in disbelief. The cause turned out to be a massive ice jam that had formed at the eastern end of Lake Erie, effectively blocking the outflow into the river. The water supply to the falls had been cut off. Not by human engineering, but by late winter weather. The public reaction was extraordinary. Churches filled with worshippers, convinced that the fall's silence was a sign of divine wrath. Nearby mill owners were concerned about the sudden loss of power to their machinery, whereas other curious-minded people walked out onto the dry riverbed. This was truly amazing. Imagine that. It was a stretch of land that had not seen dry air in thousands of years, and suddenly it was exposed. People discovered archaeological relics and weapons from the War of 1812, for example. These things were dragged down the current and just forgotten beneath the water for decades. The ice jam eventually broke roughly 30 to 40 hours after it formed, and the water returned with a wall of sound and fury. But the event lodged itself into the popular imagination, and it proved something remarkable, that the falls could be stopped. This notion planted a seed that would eventually grow into deliberate human intervention in the years to come. By the late 19th century, the falls had attracted attention as a source of incomprehensible energy. For reference, in the 1890s, Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse won a landmark contract to develop the first large-scale AC power station at Niagara. Completed in 1895, the Edward Dean Adams Power Plant transmitted electricity to the city of Buffalo and demonstrated for the first time that AC power could be sent over long distances. It was a pivotal moment in the history of electricity, and Niagara was at its center. The implications for the falls themselves, after this, were significant. Yes, they were still a massive attraction and tourist hub, but they also became a type of engineering playground. Though there was a catch. To generate hydroelectric power, water had to be diverted away from the falls through turbines. This meant that the actual volume of water flowing, and therefore the visual impact that followed, was being reduced by human activity, and the tourists immediately noticed this. Now, since local officials weren't keen to lose their tourism revenue, a compromise was needed. A topic so serious that it led to international agreements between the United States and Canada. Basically, the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 and the subsequent agreements set limits on how much water could be diverted for power generation, with specific provisions designed to preserve the scenic flow, particularly during daylight hours when tourists were watching. Even today, up to 75% of the river's water can be diverted at night for hydroelectric power, with that flow only restored to scenic levels during the day. So the falls you visit are, in a very real sense, a curated show. This balance was the perfect solution. North America enjoyed an abundance of energy. Business owners still prospered from the tourism. However, just when everything seemed perfect, the American Falls began to crumble. By the mid-20th century, a new problem had emerged. The falls were visually deteriorating. The issue was erosion, specifically the slow but relentless collapse of the rock face at the base of the American Falls. Unlike the horseshoe-shaped Canadian Falls, which plunges into a deep pool, the American Falls lands on a jumbled slope of broken rock. Over decades, periodic rockfalls had caused enormous boulders to accumulate at the base, partially burying the waterfall's lower section. By the 1960s, the American side was actually losing its visual drama as rock piled up, to the point that it began to look less like a waterfall and more like a cascade of trickling water over a pile of rubble. Accordingly, tourism authorities in New York State were alarmed and felt something had to be done. So in 1965, the International Joint Commission, the body that manages shared waters between the US and Canada, recommended a study of the problem. The question was simple enough. Could the rock accumulation be removed? Could the falls be reshaped to look more dramatic? And if so, what would that actually involve? The answer to those questions required something dramatic. Engineers would need to cut off the water supply entirely, dry the falls out. And so, the planners went to the drawing board. In the spring of 1969, the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers began constructing a temporary rock and earth cofferdam across the Niagara River. The structure was approximately 2,000 feet long and required roughly 30,000 tons of rock to build. On June the 12th, 1969, the diversion was complete, and the water that had been flowing over the falls, roughly 10 to 15% of Niagara River's total volume, was redirected entirely towards Canada. For the first time in recorded human history here, the American Falls had been deliberately stopped, and as you might imagine, the public reaction was intense. In the first days, crowds gathered at the viewing areas by the thousands, but once journalists publicized the story, hundreds of thousands followed. In some ways, this was the ultimate Niagara Falls stunt. Once the water was gone, the area became a hotbed of activity, both scientific and historical. The most immediate discovery was thousands of coins thrown into the water as wishes over generations. And there were so many of them that they were collected in buckets. Their dates presented an informal timeline, tracking the flow of visitation in the region throughout much of modern history. The second discovery was more sobering, though. 2 human bodies were found in the dry riverbed, both presumed to be victims of the falls. In at least one case, the victim was the result of a deliberate act. That being said, the geological findings were more significant. Engineers examined the exposed rock face in detail, mapping fracture lines, measuring erosion rates, and assessing the structural integrity of the caprock. Though, to everyone's great dismay, they found that the rock was more severely fractured and weakened than the previous surveys had suggested. Left unaddressed, the rate of retreat and collapse would accelerate beyond recovery. So it was at this point that engineers faced a choice. The rocks at the base of the American Falls could, in theory, be cleared to restore the waterfall's full visual drama, but it wouldn't come easy. This prospect troubled many people. Environmentalist groups argued that human intervention to shape a natural wonder was philosophically wrong, regardless of aesthetic intentions. Others pointed out that the natural appearance of Niagara had already been compromised by decades of diversions, and that a bit more engineering could hardly make things worse. And round the debate dragged on. Studies were further commissioned, proposals were drawn up, and full-scale models were built. But eventually, after months of deliberation, a decision was reached. Do not remove the rocks. The reasoning was partially practical and partly philosophical. Removing the rock pile would require an unthinkably expensive engineering operation with uncertain results. And there was also something uncomfortable about the idea of permanently reshaping a natural landmark purely for cosmetic reasons. It should also be pointed out that even with its less impactful look, the American side already had that amazing boardwalk below it, an attraction that allowed visitors to experience the falls in a way not really possible in Canada. So, in the end, the falls would stay as they were, fractured but real. On November the 25th, 1969, the cofferdam was breached, and the water returned to the American side. Workers and observers watched as the river reclaimed its course with the epic fury of Mother Nature. The 1969 dewatering project was, in many ways, the most visible moment in a much larger history of human intervention at the falls. It made explicit something that had been unfolding for decades, that Niagara Falls is not simply a force of nature anymore. It's a managed tourist attraction. We'll leave it there for today, but I thank you all for watching, and as always, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.